And 88.9 KUCI in Irvine, California. We're at the San Diego Comic-Con speaking with Mr. Kenneth Smith, artist and comic book philosopher.
Good morning, good afternoon, whenever this is.
Evening. It's been a long day. First day of the con. My first question is, what's your favorite Beatles song?
Oh, gee. Yesterday.
Really? That's nice. That's a sweet one. Okay, cool. Would you consider yourself a philosopher, by and large?
Well, yes, I do. I don't think that excludes anything else. I think.
Sure.
Philosophy is really just a way of seeing. I think. Really, it's a way of being alive to the order that's going on around you, so that it's necessary to think philosophically in order really to achieve anything intelligent, whatever you do. Artists who drive themselves to do something extraordinary, or musicians or writers or whatever field, they've learned to overcome the limitations of how those topics and issues are ordinarily seen. And that takes a kind of philosophical thinking. You have to learn how to characterize the ordinary. You have to learn how to test it, find out what its limits are. A philosophical mind, to me, is virtually the same thing as an original mind. You learn how to fracture and tear apart the paradigms that people take for granted. What makes a person philosophical is the drive to rethink everything that's taken for granted.
Continually ask questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Not accept the cant and dogma being established.
What most people think thinking is really just taking things for granted. It's been said, most people, when they think they're thinking, are really just reshuffling their prejudices, rethinking issues to their core, trying to capture the principles of what goes on in life and how human beings behave. That's something that no two people do the same way, and yet it makes the test of who is really original, who's creative. This is where we get all of the deeper structure in human understanding and existence from. So we owe it, I think, ultimately to people who refuse to accept.
Cool. Would you align yourself with any one particular philosophical school, say humanism or nihilism?
Well, I think in terms of individual thinkers, I have learned a lot from the 19th century German philosophers, from Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Marx. I think they are the last time that the issues of modern existence really got thought through to a radical degree. 20th century philosophy, by contrast, is mostly shallow and academic by comparison. There have been exceptions, but as a rule, philosophy in the 20th century has not regained the kind of penetrating and comprehensive power that it had in the last century.
I thought Wittgenstein came a little close.
Well, Wittgenstein started off with a worldview that is sort of a caricature of what modern scientific thinking has tended to take for so-called logical atomism, which he himself came very quickly to realize was just artificial and untenable. It took for granted that there are such things as atomic facts. I mean, how can you coordinate what goes on in the world of thinking and language with how things are out in the real world? And the difficulty of coordinating the two the way he wants to do it is there had to be a sort of point-by-point coordination. He realized by degrees the issues are much fuzzier, more nebulous. The problem is he had not taken into account the great function of interpretation and subjectivity in the process. Language is not a finished factual structure. You're free to formulate things however you like, and language is more plastic, it's more liquid, and that expresses the fact that ideas and language both are really functions of our subjective acts. So you push Wittgenstein far enough and you start asking the kinds of questions that Nietzsche or Hegel asked concerning the power, the lawful structures and powers and subjectivity. Why do we tend to interpret the world the way we do? And how far are we subject to laws that we don't ordinarily understand, given the way we tend to use language and the way we interact with other people? Our society tends to set constraints upon us, which Marx called ideology or false consciousness. We conform to orthodox ways of interpreting the world, which prevent us from seeing what is actually going on in the world. And Nietzsche assumed the same thing, Kierkegaard assumed the same thing concerning the way moral values bind upon us. We are far less likely to use our intuitive intelligence and far more likely to conform to what is supposed to make sense. And that official or orthodox or authoritative way of interpreting the world is really, it's like a coral reef. It's something that has grown together out of centuries upon centuries of practices and institutions, patterns of culture. Ultimately, those cultures come to grief. They collapse in upon themselves just out of their own limitations and incompetence and insanity. So the question, of course, that kind of nags at the back of the mind behind all of those thinkers is, how far is the modern world really as rational as it imagines itself to be? And how far is it making itself appear to be rational because it's asking closed patterns of questions about itself? So I'm interested again in these people because they dared to push beyond the ordinary limits of how moderns interpret themselves.
Do you think that's a cultural thing or a conscious effort on individuals' parts to accept what's been handed to them?
It is the two things really coming together into, they're flowing together. Part of it is the inertia of human nature. Nietzsche, taking a cue from the ancient Greeks, understands this as a kind of metaphysical slavishness. Human beings all have, to some degree, a kind of passivity that's just part of their basic psychology. The more people accept, the easier they make it on themselves, the less work there is to do in interpreting the issues of existence. The purpose of philosophy ultimately should be the same as the purpose of aristocratic values, which is the drive to excel, to be different, to go for the extraordinary. It's an earmark of ancient aristocracy that it valued the extraordinary just for its own sake and not because of the effects or purposes it could be put to. So the purpose of a philosophically active mind is, in Nietzsche's terms, that one should be awake just for its own sake. So many people sleepwalk through life, and for them, the value of being awake is not obvious. That's what makes them live the way they do and think that they're thinking and think that they're living. That issue really becomes acute when a form of civilization or a form of society or culture does tend to come unhinged or starts to fracture on itself. people who have not mastered this very difficult art of thinking about issues in a more penetrating way, they're living in the midst of volcanic turbulence and cataclysm, which just go right over their heads. I mean, they're not alive to those issues. So, I feel the 20th century has kind of schizophrenically done two different things at once. It has made life much more difficult for creative imaginations. The issues of the 20th century are harder for individual minds to encompass. And the educational system just starves the kinds of resources that people need in order to rise above those that fog and unclarity and uncertainty. On the other hand, the issues are there. I mean, the problems, the challenges, the crises. So if we just had the resources to know how to rise to them, this would be one of the most fantastic and
transcendent.
Yeah, it's a century that presents unprecedented problems and crises. Things are being challenged that for thousands of years were taken for granted about human nature, the order of society, values, purpose, meaning, will, freedom. We're living in an age of, I think it's proper to call it cataclysm, but most people haven't got the antenna to perceive it with. So, I mean, in effect, the very striking peculiarities of modern existence are just wasted. We produce, by means of our educational system and our mass media, we produce people whose minds have been made ordinary in the most pathetic sense of that term. They accept, they can normalize anything. I mean, you concentrate them in cities and inflict crime and high taxation, and so eventually they adapt. They get used. I mean, the sense of
good consumers.
Being able to see what is at stake. It requires a mind that is sharp and honed, and our way of existing and our peculiar form of culture really tend to dull those things in people. There's kind of a paradox in the sense the mind is really the only tool that gets sharper with proper use.
How much of it do you think there is that just complete nihilism, that they actually do realize that it's going, it's going pretty wrong, but nevertheless, don't care and say, well, heck with it,
Well, nihilism is an issue that is very widely misinterpreted. I think the way you use the term is appropriate. Nihilism has a lot to do with a profound kind of indifference to things.
Sure.
And there are people who think nihilism is trendy, sophisticated. It's another fashion of the mind that happens to be stylish in some generations or decades. Nihilism is nihilism is a civilizational pathos. It's a condition like a climate that afflicts a culture. To see what values ought to be and to see what things ought to be valued takes, on the one hand, a lively, intuitive imagination on the part of the individual, and it takes a stimulating culture on the part of the society. Now, when both of those fail together, you have a condition of nihilism that is so atmospheric that most people will not notice that it exists or that it's different from anything that went before. We have produced this kind of cultural anesthetic thanks to the narrowing of our educational curricula, the peculiar professionalization of faculty,